Hey everyone, Dan with MacRumors, and in this video we're going to compare the new iPhone XS Max to the iPhone X, and more specifically we're going to only focus in on the cameras. Before we take a look at some sample photos, let's go over some of the camera specifications of each phone. On paper, both cameras are almost identical. Both phones have a similar 12 megapixel dual camera system with an f1.8 28mm wide lens on the X and a slight but noticeably wider 26mm lens on the XS Max, as well as an f2.4 52mm telephoto lens. Both phones also have a single 7 megapixel f2.2 32mm front-facing lens located inside of the infamous notch. As far as video recordings go, both phones are of course able to shoot 4K at 24, 30, and 60 frames per second, as well as 1080p slow motion video at 240 frames per second. So where do the differences in cameras lie? Well, the main difference here is that the iPhone XS Max includes an improved image sensor that's twice as fast and 32% larger than the sensor in the iPhone X, which gives larger, deeper pixels for better performance, especially in low light conditions. The new image signal processor also improves the depth engine, which obviously helps for more detail in portrait mode and enables the new Smart HDR feature. Smart HDR introduces improved dynamic range in photos, and it brings out far more detail in the highlights and in the shadows of your images. This will also give you improved bokeh, aka background blur, that can be seen in portrait mode photos. You can also adjust the level of depth in your photo with a new depth control feature, which will give you the ability to change the f-stop of an image using the built-in slider for portrait mode images. Now with all of that said, let's go ahead and take a look at some photos between the iPhone X and XS Max. Starting off with some portrait mode photos, you can definitely see the improvement in quality with the XS Max over the X. In some photos, the improvement is subtle, but then in others, it can be fairly dramatic. There are still some areas of the image where the camera seems to struggle between the subject and the background, and this is much more prevalent around the sweatshirt and hood in this photo. It almost looks as if the hoodie was frayed, but that was not the case. If you compare this to the iPhone X, however, the image looks the same in terms of the frayed look in the hoodie, but the image also is far more overexposed than the iPhone XS Max. Another thing I want to point out is this weird artifacting or distortion that seems to be going on between the portrait mode version and the HDR version of these photos. So as you can see here, if you notice around the eyes, the portrait mode photo seems to look normal, but then the HDR is adding this weird effect where I think it's trying to smooth out the skin even more, but instead adds distortion, which is a bit strange. The image was already pretty sharp and HDR seemed to take it over the edge. The portrait mode on the iPhone XS can definitely yield some better results over the iPhone X and provide much more detail overall. This picture is a good example of just how the highlights are overexposed, and the background grass, while it is blurred, can still have a bit of detail in the XS Max over the X. The main takeaway that's consistent in almost all of the photos are either the overexposed highlights or the shadows are overcompensating on the iPhone X and providing some much darker images. The iPhone XS seems to have a much more even image throughout, and this can even be noticed in the front-facing camera. The XS front-facing camera does smooth out the image a little bit more than you would probably like, especially more than the X, but I've also noticed that when the shadows try to overtake the photo, the color profile seems to change a little bit and adds a much cooler tone, as you can see by the color blue in my shirt, or the blue tint in this photo where the subjects are primarily warmer. As far as Smart HDR goes, or just HDR in general, there is far more detail to be seen in the XS Max photo over the iPhone X. As you can see in almost every photo of the sky is in fact blown out and there is no detail in the clouds. On the iPhone XS Max, Smart HDR kicks in and is able to provide much more detail. The same can be said for low light photos too. The large sensor certainly helps let in more natural light, and it doesn't overexpose the little light that is prevalent in the picture. You can see this with the warm landscaping lights on the XS Max compared to the blown out look of the iPhone X. Even when there is little to no light whatsoever, the larger sensor is able to bring in a much smoother image on the XS Max over the iPhone X. As far as video goes, the overall look and feel is pretty similar, and the same goes for stabilization when shooting in 4K. I do think the stabilization is a little better when actually walking around with the camera in your hands, as opposed to standing still and moving your hands with the camera on the iPhone XS, but the difference is minor. There is definitely more clarity in audio and an overall robust sound with the XS Max, and that's due to the new stereo recording feature. Overall, the iPhone XS Max definitely yields a better image than the 10, and there are noticeable differences, but for me personally, as someone who really does not take a lot of photos or videos on their smartphones, I'm not sure the difference is worth the upgrade. So let me know what you think of these two iPhone cameras in the comment section down below. This has been Dan with MacRumors. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.